everybody to this ethnicity centre seminar in which Dr. Neema Begum is going to present as a paper. Some of you, of course, know Neema very well because she was a PhD student here not so many years ago. She's now an assistant professor of British politics in the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Nottingham. She's a political scientist researching ethnic minority voting behaviour, political participation and representation. Following her PhD, she interviewed 94 local councillors in a study of ethnicity, gender and political party of the UK local councillors. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm getting garbled. That's a project that she did at the University of Manchester. Her own PhD here, as some of you know, was on race and identity in voting in the 2016 EU referendum, on which Neema's gone on to publish a couple of pieces. And I think the last bit of information I have here to share with you about Neema is that she's also worked on the Evidence for Equality National Survey, Evans, on ethnic minority experience of the coronavirus pandemic. And her talk today, as you can see from the slide, is Immigrants Against Immigration. And I'll hand over to you now, Neema, and say anything else you'd like to say by way of introduction, either to yourself or to other research you've done. Thank you very much. We're looking forward to it.
Thank you, Tariq, for the introduction, and thank you all for joining. I'm sorry I couldn't join you in person. I'm currently on research leave. I'm in Houston doing a research visit in the Department of Political Science at the University of Houston. I'll return to the UK at the end of January. So Tariq set this up to be hybrid. So as Tariq mentioned, thank you for the kind introduction. I did my PhD at the University of Bristol, had Therese O'Toole and Paula Sarridge as my supervisors. I also received a lot of support from Professor John Fox and Tariq as well. So very happy to join you today to talk about some of the work that's coming out of my PhD. And so I have a paper published on attitudes to the European Union amongst British ethnic minorities. This paper is focused on immigration attitudes and how that influenced voting in the EU referendum. So I want to start actually by talking about this mayoral debate that I went to quite recently in Houston, where one of the candidates is a Pakistani-American MJ Khan. During the mayoral debate, the question of Central American immigration into Houston came up as an issue, and MJ Khan's response was, I came in through the front door, and he spoke quite negatively about Central American immigration coming into Houston. So this isn't necessarily a new phenomenon, or it's quite widespread. If we look at different minority and immigrant groups, this concept of pulling the ladder up, and how different migrants and minorities relate, how different minorities relate to newer migrants, it's not necessarily a positive story of solidarity and based on shared experiences of migration. So this is what this presentation will speak to. So for this presentation, I'll start by talking about the referendum and the Brexit context, and how freedom of movement became a problem, and how the issue of EU membership became a highly salient issue, which it hadn't been for quite a while. And then I'll talk about some of the theoretical expectations on ethnic minority attitudes to immigration and what we might expect. And And then I'll talk about the methods that I used for my PhD, and then some of my findings from the interviews and focus groups that emerged. And I'll end by talking about some of the implications for understanding ethnic minority attitudes to immigration. So to start off with, how did freedom of movement become a problem? The UK historically has been the most Eurosceptic country in Europe. There's very generally quite weak identification as European in the UK compared to other European countries on the continent. But freedom of movement in particular became an issue following the accession of Poland, Bulgaria, and Romania to the European Union, and more migration from Eastern Europe to the UK through the principle of freedom of movement. So the issue of EU membership and immigration became intrinsically linked, and the idea that being in the EU was leading to uncontrolled and uncontrollable levels of migration, particularly from Eastern Europe. So I think it's worth mentioning that there has been significant migration from Western Europe for many years. It was really only when Eastern Europeans came to arrive to the UK in much bigger numbers since the accession that this became more of a problem. And you can see some of the headlines in the right-wing media around and mainly scaremongering around people, EU citizens coming from parts of Eastern Europe seeking to, or assertions that people were coming to take advantage of the welfare state, and there were increasing numbers of migrants from Eastern Europe that needed to be controlled. So the idea of Brexit becoming associated with racism, or support for Brexit becoming associated with racism, kind of emerged from seeing the language used around the Brexit campaigns. For example, the Leave.eu campaign released the Breaking Point poster, which you can see Nigel Farage in front of, using the refugee crisis beginning in 2015 as a way to criticize EU membership, and that that freedom of movement within the EU could be taken advantage of by refugees trying to come into the UK, and also the Vote Leave campaign. Sorry, it's a bit cut off in this, but the Vote Leave campaign presented Turkey joining the EU as imminent, and the prospect of millions of people from a majority Muslim country coming to the UK through freedom of movement. In this poster, you can see on the bottom left, the Leave campaign pointed to the proximity of Turkey to Syria and Iraq, and presented Turkey joining the EU as a gateway for refugees from war-torn parts of the Middle East to come into the UK. So race and racism is seen to play a part in the way that the referendum took place, even though it was EU freedom of movement and mainly Eastern Europeans that were seen to be a problem in the referendum. So in terms of how ethnic minorities related to the referendum, this is a poster that was released by Operation Black Vote, which campaigns for greater democratic participation, voter registration, and so on amongst ethnic minorities. So in this, you can see a vote is a vote. And this really presents the idea that ethnic minorities should vote Remain to counter the racism underlying some parts of the Brexit vote, and really associating support for Brexit with right-wing racist nationalism. And some of a lot of people's fears around Brexit were confirmed following the referendum. There was a sharp increase in hate crimes against ethnic minorities, and the idea that leaving the EU meant not just freedom of movement ending, but also decreasing racial and ethnic diversity, which isn't necessarily linked to freedom of movement, but was a way that racial and ethnic diversity was also being pushed back against, and the EU referendum and Brexit was an opportunity to do that, and I was seen as emboldening racists across the UK. So in terms of ethnic minority voting behaviour in the referendum, most minorities were more pro-Remain. So I have a paper in ethnic and racial studies on ethnic minority attitudes towards Europe, and I find that most of ethnic minorities did vote Remain, not necessarily as an endorsement of EU membership, but because of the racism and xenophobia that they perceived within the Leave campaigns. However, a third of ethnic minorities did vote to leave the EU, which did come as a surprise, even though minorities overwhelmingly voted to remain in the EU. And here you can see more of a ethnic breakdown. So this is from the Understanding Society longitudinal study, and you can see that British Indians were the most likely to support leaving the EU compared to other minority groups, and was slightly more comparable to the white British in their support for leave. So in terms of ethnic minority attitudes to immigration and how we can make sense of this, there's generally positive attitudes towards immigration amongst immigrants and racialized minorities or subsequent generations of migrants or children and grandchildren of migrants. So this can be linked to this idea of immigrant-linked fate or group empathy theory, that shared experiences of migration will produce solidarity between immigrants, regardless of their countries of origin, and also this idea of linked fate or a sense of connected political futures, that the rights of immigrants should be protected, and people should work together on those, and not necessarily see different groups as divided. But there's also this idea of realistic group conflict, that immigrant groups are likely to compete for resources. Lower socioeconomic status means that there's more direct competition for job opportunities and for scarce public resources, especially in the UK since austerity in 2010. So there are different ways that this might manifest in terms of how immigrants might relate to newer migrant groups. So for my PhD, I, as well as doing quantitative analysis of the Understanding Society longitudinal study, I conducted semi-structured focus groups and interviews with ethnic minority, Remain and Leave voters. So I recruited in areas of high ethnic minority population, mainly areas that were frequented by members of the public, so libraries, churches, mosques, temples, and community centres. And I conducted 11 focus groups and 6 individual interviews, and participants were of different ethnic backgrounds, including white British, but for this paper, I'll focus on the ethnic minority participants. and I conducted a thematic analysis of the interview and focus group data. So really looking at minority attitudes within the EU referendum and what motivated them to vote either leave or remain, and also how attitudes to immigration also influence minority voting in the referendum. So to start off with, I already mentioned amongst ethnic minorities, supporting Remain was for many more a vote against Brexit. So for this participant, who's from a Black African background, who took part in a Remain voting focus group, so he said, I was sort of voting against Make Britain Great Again, against the ideology that we should push out anyone who's brown or Black. I was voting against the propaganda that Europeans have come to our country, they're taking our jobs. Although we were voting on the EU only, even though I'm not from the EU, it still feels like it's aimed at me a bit as well. I'm trying to prevent the ideology that immigration is a problem. So in this case, the participant saw the anti-immigrant language being used against Eastern Europeans as being directed at him as well, as an immigrant or someone who wasn't born in the UK, and saw this as a way of pushing back against this ideology that he refers to, that immigration is a problem. So generally, this is what I found amongst Remain supporters voting against what they felt were anti-immigration sentiments. And this is consistent with a Runnymede report that came out in 2015 called This Is Still About Us, and how ethnic minorities feel differently about immigration debates and feel, even if they're British born, if they're British citizens, that the immigration or anti-immigration narratives are directed against them, and that they're still perceived as immigrants, even if they're born in the UK, and that this is still about us. And so I won't go into it here, but I also, when conducting interviews and focus groups with white British Brexit voters, some of the topics that came up included Black Lives Matter, the Rotherham grooming scandal, different issues that they had with rising racial and ethnic diversity in the UK, which they associated with immigration. So immigration just in general was leading to racial and ethnic diversity that they weren't comfortable with, and they voted for Brexit in response to that, even though, as this participant mentions, they're not from the EU, and we were voting on EU membership, and freedom of movement was what was at stake. But people felt as though they were being targeted as well by this the anti-immigrant language and the sentiments around voting for Brexit. But for the rest of this paper, I'm going to focus on the Brexit voters amongst ethnic minorities and why they voted to leave. And one of the main reasons was Eastern European immigration. So for this interviewee, he says, I do find that unlimited low-skilled immigration would be bad for this country, especially the poorest here. It's just going to depress wages. So in that regard, I think it has been especially bad for the working classes in this country. I've got nothing against immigrants. A lot of them are coming here. They're working much harder than even what the local people here would do. But I'm guessing they're not here to settle. I'd say it's more earning money in a richer economy and sending remittances back home to wherever they come from. So it's interesting here that a lot of the narratives and issues that people have had against ethnic minorities are being directed against a newer migrant group. So issues with sending remittances, or the newer migrants depress wages for the native population, that migrants are coming to the UK to take care from poorer countries, to take advantage of the UK as a richer economy. So language and narratives that you might expect from or have historically been used against ethnic minorities of being almost repeated and very similar, similarly coming from someone who's a second generation ethnic minority in the UK. So they speak to the labour competition, for example, posed by Eastern European migrants. So another participant, on this occasion, who was a Remain voter, refers to this perception of Eastern Europeans are coming and taking all the Asian jobs, so corner shops, taxis, kebab shops, restaurants as well. So this is very similar to immigrants are taking the British jobs, but here the competition is seen as between minority groups and migrant groups that Eastern Europeans are pose a competition to ethnic minorities, particularly South Asians who tend to work in certain industries like catering and retail. So the other participants also mentioned the effects of immigration and the pressures on public services. So we see this as well a lot of the time when talking about immigration. There's not a lot of mention of austerity and the cuts to the health service and all the public services, but it's squarely associated with mass immigration. So in this case, the participant says, the basic problem was the mass immigration in this country. I've been living in this town 31 years. I've never seen anything like this. Whenever I go to my doctor, I have to wait 3 to 4 hours to see my doctor. It takes 4 to 5 weeks to get an appointment because of the immigration. The people, especially from Poland and Romania, and get Hungary coming, Bulgaria as well. They just could not cope. The education, medication, social life affected so badly. So they directly associate pressures on public services with Eastern European immigration, and that this was at unsustainable levels, and this was unprecedented before the Eastern European immigration to the UK. So we also see welfare chauvinism amongst minorities and perceptions of Eastern Europeans coming to the UK to take advantage of the welfare state. So this participant says people who actually need, if they come, obviously that's totally different. Some people, they don't need to. I think they just sort of abuse the system. Some of them do, I think. So the other participant goes on that, yeah, before Brexit, we heard about people coming and then they only have to be here 4 months and they can start to go on benefits. And so it sounded like they were only coming to go on benefits. So this again is associated with Eastern Europeans coming from poorer economies of the EU to take advantage of the welfare state, and perceptions that they were coming to take advantage of the welfare state in the UK. Similarly, there was a lot of negative stereotypes that were being that were understood and being perpetuated. So this participant refers to some footage that she had seen around crimes being committed by people from parts of Eastern Europe. So she says, people coming here, and I saw a few documentaries where they were going into drugs and then putting those little cameras on cash points. In the documentary, they did focus on, just made it look like it was only people from the EU that were doing these kinds of things, these kinds of crimes. They did make it sound like cash point crime, that's especially coming from the immigration, people coming from the EU. Their focus is just to basically wipe our bank accounts out and thinking that we're so rich and just send it back home. So again, this idea that people from other parts of Europe, Eastern Europe particularly, were coming to the UK to take advantage of a richer economy, but also they were committing crimes against the native population. So here you can actually see very explicitly that they associate the EU very closely with Eastern European immigration. It was almost as if the EU this was the first time the EU had come to their doorstep and was significantly affecting their lives. And this is the way that they perceived EU membership as a problem, that it was leading to more crime because of migration from parts of Eastern Europe. So the participant goes on to say, and then they went and filmed lavish houses that they were building in those countries, the kind of lifestyle they had there now because of sort of just robbing people here, robbing the bank accounts and the drugs and things. So again, attributing criminality, but also this idea that people were coming from parts of Eastern Europe to take advantage of the UK as well-meaning hosts, and the unfairness and the injustice that they would be taking advantage of the UK for welfare state. They would be committing crime and robbing the native population just to go back to their home countries and build lavish houses there. So really quite deep levels of dehumanization and fear and insecurity around that as well. So there were also more explicit forms of xenophobia against Eastern Europeans. So in this extract, the participant says, "I don't want to sound racist. There's so many people coming from, other countries. They're just sort of taking over. We're not mixing in with each other. I think that, like us, that we've been here for many years, and that community coming over, like mostly Romanians, gypsies and stuff, we're not mixing everything. So they're staying separate. Their lifestyle is completely different. I don't know. I don't feel comfortable with so many of them. A lot of rubbish dumping I've seen." And the other participant says refers to dirt issues. And the first participant talks about people going through bins and not feeling comfortable around them. So this is actually very similar to the language that has been historically used against ethnic minorities, that they aren't integrating, that they're different, and they have different lifestyles, they're taking over, and there's some very deeply racialized ideas around dirt and being unsanitary and so on, that's being directed against Eastern Europeans as well. You can notice as well that they're referred to Roma people and associate them with Eastern Europeans, or there's not really, it's a sort of undifferentiated mass of others that they see as coming over and taking over, and express a lot of quite negative and racialized ideas about outsiders, about them as outsiders. So we also see this good immigrant, bad immigrant binary being reinforced, and minorities feeling like they must socially distance themselves from stigmatized migrants or minorities. So this participant says, "My parents came and they've become British and they've embraced it. They've learned what the rules are here and what the law is." So really talking about themselves as the good migrants and being law-abiding and so on, and having integrated and so on, compared to newer migrants from Eastern Europe. So similarly, a different focus group, they reinforce this good immigrant, bad immigrant binary. So this participant says, "My identity is British Bangladeshi. We work hard, we go to school, we go to college, we go to uni, we work, we pay tax, we obey the law and order." But those people coming, they don't care. They just come 2-3 months, take all the cars, hijack, they just leave. So they're not British. So really marking themselves out as different and socially distancing themselves from what they perceive as and present as bad migrants who they say aren't British, or they come to commit crime, or they don't work or pay taxes or go to university and aren't seeking to better their lives in the ways that they have, but are coming to take advantage of being in the UK. So there was also this idea of Eastern Europe as being less civilized compared to Britain. So this participant continues to say that the British system, they haven't got anything like this. They're Romanian, Bulgarian, Albanian. They keep coming, committing crime. I don't think once they leave the country, they haven't been able to prosecute them in this country. It affects, the British identity, and they are not British. They cause crime. We don't, but everybody gets the blame. So here they really assert themselves as being British compared to newer migrants from Eastern Europe, and claim their stake as British, but also try and distance themselves in saying that newer migrants from Eastern Europe were giving them as migrants a bad name, and also reinforcing this idea that they had embraced Britishness and had and British values, but newer migrants from Eastern Europe were different and don't know how to be British. There are also concerns that Britain's membership of the EU meant that they were neglecting their relationships with the Commonwealth. So this participant refers to historical links between Britain and the Commonwealth. There's a historical link. We, our ancestor, came to this country, contributed to British economy, building infrastructure. Even lots of our ancestors fought in the Second World War in favor of Britain. They sacrificed their lives, and that's how we are in Commonwealth country. What's good to have being a member of the Commonwealth country? So here they talk about what are the benefits of being a member of the Commonwealth country if Britain is part of the EU and part of that as a trading bloc, and you feel that they were being neglected as a result, and that their contributions were being ignored, and also they speak about their contribution to British identity. And Britain, for example, having fought alongside Britain in the Second World War, while Britain was at war with its European neighbours, and now they seem to be in this trading club and neglecting their relationships with us is the kind of story that's coming out here. But I just want to flag that there's no kind of mention of colonialism or exploitation or any of these parts of the Commonwealth relationship with Britain and how the Commonwealth came to be, but rather that it was EU membership that was leading to Britain neglecting those relationships. So there's also this perception of EU freedom of movement, meaning unfair immigration rules, and that because freedom of movement, because of the principle of freedom of movement, immigration had to be restricted from other parts of the world, and that meant there were fewer visas being issued for people from around the Commonwealth. So this participant says, historically, Bangladesh is connected to Britain, but since European Union, they've been more connecting and we've been pushed out and we've been ignored by British government. They're concentrating more on Europeans, like Eastern European people. They've been prioritized and we've been deprived from our right, our importancy. We've just felt like second-class citizens. They've been prioritized and we've been neglected. We've been stopped bringing our spouse, wife, husband from Bangladesh. That's how the difference is. So we feel infuriated. So they really associate the principle of freedom of movement as leading to unfair immigration rules, even though it was the British government who sets those parameters, and the Home Office issues visas and so on. But the perception elsewhere has been as well that because EU freedom of movement meant that migration from Europe couldn't be controlled, those controls fell elsewhere, and people from the Commonwealth were bearing the brunt of that. So I'll finish by talking about some of the implications of the findings from this field research, and how we might understand anti-immigration attitudes amongst immigrants and racialized minorities. So from a lot of these excerpts from the focus groups and interviews, there is evidence of acculturation into an anti-immigration norm, and the dominant social norms and values that are prevalent in the native population, including the negative stereotyping of immigrants, is coming out in how ethnic minorities relate to immigrants, particularly from Eastern Europe, and that strong identification with the host nation and strong level of integration meant more acculturation into this anti-immigration norm. We also see that assimilated ethnic minority group members consider themselves as part of the majority group and therefore mirror the white majority's immigration attitudes. And also there's a sense of symbolic boundary making and social distancing from those perceived as bad migrants in wider society, and reinforcing that some immigrants are a threat to the nation, and endorsing the need for strong borders in some cases. And that is used to claim their insider status, that they demonstrate their commitment to protecting the nation from the wrong type of immigrants by distancing themselves from the more stigmatized migrants, despite being part of stigmatized minority groups themselves. And in this case, specifically Eastern Europeans. So I think maybe during the Q&A, we can talk about how the demonization and stigmatization of Eastern Europeans has became so acceptable and was being perpetuated and repeated by a lot of minority groups in a way that's never really been Western Europeans or people from France or Germany wouldn't really be spoken about in this way. So I think I'll leave it there, and I look forward to receiving your questions.
Thank you, Neema. We'll take some questions or comments from the room or from online. So I see John's just joined us, so no doubt he's got lots of questions. I see one hand up, it's Dan. So Dan, do you want to unmute yourself and go ahead?
It wasn't actually a question, it was a clap.
I beg your pardon. Okay, well, Catherine's got her hand up. So Catherine, you come in.
Hi, thank you very much, Neema. And first, apologies. I gather I was on camera when I was trying to eat oatcakes without using my hands. I just apologize for that.
I didn't notice, you're all good.
Hadn't got any hand gel. I'm so sorry. Thanks, Therese, for alerting me. Thank you. That was really interesting. I was particularly interested because I also was doing, I had a research project with British South Asians about transnational marriage in the run-up to the Brexit referendum. And so some of the things that you talked about were familiar from that, but as it had been your focus, you had far more rich data, and you had themes that made some connections for me that was really useful. So I think that's really helpful. Thank you very, very much. I was, of course, really interested in the bit about marriage migration. So they've been prioritized, Eastern Europeans have been prioritized, but we can't bring in our husband or wife from Bangladesh. And we had some similar kind of comments. But one thing that we had, I remember somebody saying, to distinguish themselves from this other kinds of immigration, saying, but when people are married, there's a kinship connection, you know, that's different. If you're married to someone, you should be able to come into the country. It's not the same as just, you know, economic migration or whatever. And you talked about the Commonwealth links, but I wondered whether kinship connections came up at all in other places of your research.
I think that's a really good question. There has been this perception that it never used to be like this. We used to be able to bring whoever we wanted, and it's because of perception that it's because of Eastern European immigration. But I think it didn't necessarily come up in terms of kinship networks. I think there was a sense maybe that Commonwealth migration was more legitimate and more because of the historical links and because of the contribution of the Commonwealth to Britain and Commonwealth migrants, and that there isn't this historical relationship with Eastern European or Eastern Europe with the UK, or I think it came up more in terms of that and less so about familial connections. And but I think that did feature quite a lot in the Brexit campaign, including UKIP MEPs talking about, why should someone not be able to bring their grandmother over from Pakistan for a wedding, whereas someone from Eastern Europe can just come to the country straight away, and that these aren't fair rules being applied, and also presenting it as racist, that this white migrants are being prioritized over ethnic minorities or racialized minorities from around the world. I mean, that's had always really been the case, but in this case it was more unacceptable that it was Eastern Europeans who were getting an quote unquote unfair advantage over minorities from the Commonwealth.
It's really interesting. I'd be interesting to sort of follow up, would be interesting, wouldn't it? Given that there haven't been a relaxation in family immigration rules, for example, since it'd be interesting to follow up and see whether how people feel that it's worked out in that way.
Yeah, completely. I think Sunak recently was talking about bringing down migration numbers by reducing the number of visas issued to dependents of people working in the UK. I think maybe it's at Bristol or another university where an academic hasn't been able to bring her 6-year-old daughter over.
It's at Bristol, yeah.
It's at Bristol, yeah. And yeah, the kind of yeah, so yeah, it would be interesting to follow up on that.
Thank you. John, you're next.
Thanks, Tarek, and thank you, Neema. I'm really sad that you're not here. It would be really lovely to see you in person, but gave me an excuse to stay home today. So yeah, fabulous talk too. Fabulous presentation. Really enjoyed it. Just so one reflection is that you may know this, Magda and I did a paper after this. I mean, first of all, I should have cited you. I can't believe that. I mean, it's so relevant to what you were doing, but on East Europeans and their kind of response to being here in the UK, and basically it's the same thing you just showed us, just going the other direction. And so it's really interesting that in your analysis, it's the Eastern Europeans who are in the crosshairs, and all they do is just kind of reverse the target and target all the visible ethnic minorities in the UK. I mean, that's a gross overstatement, but that's the we had data very similar to that, and it doesn't suggest that all of them were doing this, but just like your data shows, is there is a segment of the population who is doing this kind of thing. So just to kind of give the wider context of that. But my question really is on, so both here in your presentation, and certainly the way Mag and I approach this in our research, we found this problematic, and I think that comes across in your presentation quite clearly, that even when you have the sort of toned down versions of these things, I think there's you aren't too explicit in your actual criticism of them, but I don't know, maybe that's just me reading that into it based on my own perspective. But then there's Tarek on this, and then Tarek is scrunching his forehead. He wrote a paper in 2014, Tarek, with Anna Triantafilidou on. I've got it up on my computer right now. I was just looking at it as we're talking, but making a much more normative political argument that isn't dissimilar from this in terms of protecting the delicate gains of multiculturalism over the generations against changes in immigration, changes in ethnicity, race, all sorts of different things. And so I puts together, I mean, I don't agree with the argument, but he puts together a kind of, normative political theory argument. So I just wondered, Neema, I don't know if you've seen that paper, but where do you sit on this kind of question in terms of you know, what's going on. If you look at your implication slide, it seems to suggest that you know, this is those ethnic minorities protecting those gains that they sort of have achieved over the years, and trying to situate themselves alongside or as part of a British majority that should be kind of concerned about questions of immigration. So I just wondered where you sat on this, and you can answer it normatively, or you can answer it in respect to the data that you presented, and then maybe Tara can come in if he wants to.
Yeah, thank you so much, John, for joining and for your comments on the paper. From a normative perspective, I think demonizing an already stigmatized minority group is not the way to go about it, and actually is reinforcing a lot of the anti-immigrant stereotypes and narratives that are used against, or have historically been used against, minorities, and continue to be. And I mean, speaking to British Muslims who are some of the most stigmatized, and the kind of language around crime and not being integrated and, you know, living separate parallel lives, that's continuously used against British Muslims. I don't think that's something that should be, it doesn't serve anyone's interests to perpetuate those narratives. And actually, I have a real issue with people saying my ancestors died for Britain in the Second World War. I mean, why do we have to spill our bloods to be acceptable to the British nation, and to even to stake our legitimacy when it goes much further back in terms of the colonial relationship, and it becomes this question of, you know, what are you contributing, and you know, and this kind of social distancing and perpetuating this idea that you need to make a positive contribution to Britain when there are so many challenges around reparations and what is owed to minorities around the world by the British state. So I don't think it. I think it serves very cynical interests to perpetuate these ideas, really. I mean, I don't know if Tarek would agree.
Well, perhaps I just clarify what I was arguing in the paper that John refers to, and obviously I can send you a copy, or anyone else who's interested. So first of all, I should say that in relation to what you've just said, I say that there is certain aspects of multiculturalism that have implications for how we should talk about immigration or migration, and especially how we should talk about migrants. I mean, there are some policy implications in terms, there could be some policy implications, let's say that way, but there are just implications for what we might call anti-racist norms, anti-racializing norms, not demonizing and stigmatizing, to use the expressions you used just now. So that was in fact part of my argument. But the bit that John was referring to was that my argument was that there can be a number of reasons, you know, possible reasons, some of which we might agree with, some of which we might not, for thinking that immigration needs to be managed in a particular kind of way. For instance, the scale of immigration, or the pace of immigration, or all kinds of other things, like you mentioned one just now about dependents, number of dependents, versus caps for, you know, salary caps at a floor level, you know, has to be earning above a certain amount, which is in the newspapers at the moment, or it can be preferring particular types of migrants to other types, so preferring students to non-students and so on. So my view was that there can be a lot of different reasons. And the question was, for me, can multiculturalism have some reasons of its own? So the first thing I wanted to say was, that multiculturalism is not necessarily pro-immigration or anti-immigration. And in particular, I wanted to disconnect my understanding of multicultural equality, which is grounded in ideas about citizenship equality and the respect owed to citizens and their identities, disconnect that from an argument about a kind of cosmopolitanism which emotes national identification in general, possibly even thinks there's something suspect about national identification, and the world would be a better place if it didn't exist. So other forms of identification, like ethnic identification or religious identification, would be okay, but national identification either shouldn't exist or there should be less of it. So I wanted to say that multiculturalism doesn't necessarily connect with the cosmopolitanism I've just described, and therefore some of the immigration policy implications of that kind of cosmopolitanism don't follow from a more national citizenship grounded multiculturalism. But one thing that did follow is that a multiculturalist may well want to consider the implications of the consequences of certain kinds of migration at a particular time and place, which were destabilizing for the promotion of multicultural equality. So some of these would be to do with discourses of racialization and demonizing migrants and so on. But some of them could also be about protecting the gains of multiculturalism from possible consequences. And so that relates then to John's study, because his study, as I think you're aware, and of course is not the only one, there's a number of other studies now, but I think John has been a pioneer in this, in showing how there's certain kinds of racism against ethnic minority people, and Muslims seem to be particularly targeted by some groups of migrants from Eastern Europe. So that would be a relevant consideration for someone designing an immigration policy that was designed to protect or promote multiculturalism. And having mentioned, John's research, in a way, I was interested in an implication from his research, which he himself didn't mention, and that is, did any of your focus groups or interviews or any other research that you're aware of, did it mention that one of the reasons that ethnic minorities might be not so keen on more immigration and might have voted leave or just generally not be so keen on immigration of a certain kind, is because that they might be fearful of certain kinds of racism against them, or certain kinds of favoritism for the new migrants who may be white against established British people who are not white, because that's one of the clear findings from John's research, that this could happen. And indeed, I should mention this afternoon, it's one of the very strong findings from a Bristol PhD student, Marcin Polak, who actually just this very afternoon, just a couple of hours ago, has been recommended for PhD, the award of PhD by his examiners. So very fitting to mention him, though he's not present at the moment. So there's a couple of different aspects that I put to you that relate to the paper that John was referring to by me, but also aspects of his research.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. It didn't come out as much in my focus group, surprisingly. But I remember speaking to my mom, who she voted for Brexit, and one of her main reasons was Eastern Europeans. And she said something along the line, I don't know how to translate it into English, but it was a kind of, they will have power over us soon. Or it was the kind of, because of their whiteness, that, you know, they have an advantage over us, and they will have power over us, and they will kind of leapfrog us, is the kind of sentiment that she expressed. So, and I think it does come out a bit in some of the focus groups when they talk about feeling inferior or feeling like second-class citizens. But I think it's more, I think that was maybe more in relation to immigration rules. But there is maybe it's hinted at in this idea that we're not mixing and we're not really getting along. There wasn't as much indication or perceptions of racism from Eastern Europeans towards them as minorities, or that didn't really come out in the work that I did. But I think that is quite common, unfortunately. I think even amongst some work on Ukrainian refugees and Ukrainians being racist towards minorities, or I think generally people from Eastern Europe being surprised by the level of racial and ethnic diversity, and were expecting to come to another majority white nation, and actually got moving into areas where more deprived urban areas where there are more ethnic minorities. So yeah, I think surprisingly it didn't come out much, but there's I think it does raise a question around kind of who benefits from the gains that have been made, and historically maybe ethnic minorities have fought for. There's, you know, for example, I was speaking to a colleague about affirmative action and in the US, and some African Americans being resentful of newer migrants from Africa being able to benefit from affirmative action policies, and because they haven't had the same experiences of being Black in the US, and haven't lived that experience of subjugation, or they're not descendants of enslaved people, for example. So yeah, this question of who gets to benefit from what we fought for is an interesting one, I think. But I think it's becomes framed as this zero-sum game, that some minorities benefiting means that other minorities don't, and it becomes this sort of competition, and maybe just being too idealistic, but I don't think it necessarily has to be. And actually this is the problem, that it becomes framed as this competition, and that different minority groups are pitted against each other. But you know, maybe that's just the reality.
Thank you. Dan has been patiently waiting to come in. Now's your chance, Dan.
Thanks, Tarek, and thank you, Neema. That was I found that absolutely fascinating, and yeah, it made me think back to when we first started our PhDs. We started our PhDs at the same time, and back in 2015, I remember thinking that your topic was absolutely fascinating then. So it's great. What are we? 8 years later to be hearing about in a bit more detail about the project and some of the work that you've been doing since. I've got a couple of questions. The first one is probably the simplest question. I wondered whether gender came into any of those focus group discussions or interviews. I guess a lot of the anti-Eastern European narratives in sort of public discourse were centered around sort of hardworking laborers who were going to come and take people's jobs, and I guess also in the case of people from Albania, often ideas about sort of bogus asylum seekers are often assumed to be male. So yeah, I wondered whether that was a feature. And then the second question, I guess it sort of struck me that So, you know, again, in sort of public discourse around, anti-immigration, it's often, you know, things like crime, culture, and jobs that come up. And I think those were sort of present in your in the quotes that you showed as well. But I think maybe something that kind of maybe is less, that features less in public discourse is this idea of remittances and people coming and taking money and sending it home. And that seemed to come up a few times from your ethnic minority participants. And in fact, I think one person even used the word remittances. So, you know, I don't think most people in Britain would know what that word means. So I just wondered whether, you know, did you get the sense, or did people articulate the sense that immigration is an area on which, you know, they felt that they had kind of expertise at, you know, as either as either migrants themselves or being descended recently or being descended from recent migrants. So yeah, and if so, you know, is you know, does being anti-migration become a way of asserting authority and power, maybe through that kind of enhanced knowledge of the migration process?
Yeah, thank you, Dan. I think those are all really important questions. The question on gender, it didn't really come out in my presentation, but some of the paper that I've done on ethnic minority attitudes towards the EU and the kind of some minorities voting leave because they thought the EU was more Islamophobic, and particularly the Muslim women that I interviewed who were hijab wearing British Muslim women who talked about how their rights as Muslim women were more protected in the UK compared to other parts of Europe. And you talked about the hijab and niqab bans in other parts of on continental Europe, and that, you know, that and they also talked about how that was instituted at an elite level, and it wasn't just, you know, street harassment. It was, these were bans initiated at the by these European states, and one of the quotes was, "I don't know how Muslims live there," like, you know, compared to the UK. And so as Muslim women, they felt safer in the UK compared to other parts of Europe. I think also the kind of gendered aspects came out when in the white British focus groups with Brexit voters, particularly talking about the Rotherham scandal and the threat of migrant men, even though they didn't necessarily distinguish between British ethnic minorities and migrants. It was this expression of migrant men and minority men being sexual predators. And also they talked about South Asian women, you know, not being economically active and, you know, being held back, and the kind of femo-nationalism as well that of, you know, becoming the biggest feminists all of a sudden when it came to talking about Muslim women. So yeah, that didn't necessarily come out in this paper. I think moving on to your point about remittances, I think it's an interesting question where it's why that is seen as inappropriate for people to do when people can spend their money on whatever they want for whatever cause they want. But there's this idea of people coming and taking away and sending it back to another place. whereas, I mean, I would say, don't tell me how to spend my money. I can send money back to my family in Bangladesh. That's not, you know, and people, you know, spend their money however they want. But in this case, it's this idea of outsiders coming and taking away and sending it back to another place and not keeping the wealth within Britain. It's an interesting question around expertise, and I think maybe that came out around the idea of we've learned how to be British and we know how to obey the law, and you know, we know more than these people do because they're newcomers and they're outsiders, whereas we are now well-established insiders or part of the in-group. Could you remind me of your last question, actually?
Yeah, I guess it was sort of, I guess I was wondering if you know, having that in that sort of in-depth knowledge of migration and remittances, you know, does that and you know, I guess other knowledge on migration in general, does that create a sense of, you know, does that mean that when sort of discussing immigration, you know, and I guess one form of doing that is you know, being involved in that discussion could be voting for Brexit and taking an anti-immigration stance, does like based on that knowledge, like is that a way of kind of asserting authority or power? You know, does immigration become a kind of forum through which people of ethnic minority background who yeah, can sort of assert authority in some way? Yeah, I'm still kind of working out how to frame that question.
I think that's an interesting question. Yeah. I think maybe it's a forum where they normally feel disempowered, and this was an opportunity to assert some power. I mean, you know, as British citizens or Commonwealth citizens who are eligible to vote in UK elections and referendums, and you know, EU citizens weren't able to vote in the EU referendum, so that was one kind of advantage, or if you want to call it that, that they had. I think yeah, it's difficult to unpack that. I think especially when a lot of these groups are already kind of seen as or perceive themselves as being lower in the pecking order, and actually now there's another group that's more stigmatized than we are, or in that we can assert our authority and our sense of belonging and legitimacy more over this group that is somehow become acceptable to be so critical towards, when, as I mentioned earlier, we didn't have these discourses around Western Europeans. It was Eastern Europeans who became the problem. I think John can speak to that as well, and you know, where those ideas form and how that became acceptable and how that seeped into the way that ethnic minorities talked about Eastern Europeans as well.
Dan's question makes me think about how, you know, the emergence of a new Asian cabinet minister elite. It is interesting. They all tend to be very right-wing on a whole host of issues, but especially on immigration and integration type issues. And we've now had 3 or 4 Home Secretaries who've been tasked with bringing down immigration numbers, etc., who have been ethnic minorities, including obviously the present incumbent, the new incumbent. But we have a question in the room. So I'll let you put your question. You can be heard from where you are. Neema will tell us if she can't hear you, but I think you will be able to be heard. But you won't be able to be seen because the camera only points in this direction. But say,
you can go up if you want.
say who you are and introduce yourself, and then go ahead and ask your question.
Have I got time? Because I realise we've gone over. Is that okay?
We haven't gone over.
Oh, is it not till 5?
We've got the room till 4:30.
Oh, okay.
Oh, 5:30, 5:30.
Right, so I'm Sharon Walker. I'm a lecturer at the School of Education. So I just have a question, and I think in some ways maybe it's already been answered. I'm not sure. One of the things if I had to kind of categorize what their responses were into two groups. On the one hand, I've got people doing their absolute best to prove they're British against all costs. And on the other hand, they're almost running away from being attacked as being the immigrant themselves by hiding in the shade of Britain. They've got this kind of very strange relationship with Britain. And so I'm wondering whether in your research, how do you go about theorizing some of those dynamics that are going on? And so, for example, you mentioned something that your mother said, they will one day have power over us, which suggests to me that there's something there to do with racialized power. And so when you're thinking and looking at these things, are you approaching them through discourses of whiteness or understandings of whiteness? Are you looking at them through ideas of the racial state? Are you looking at them through ideas of how Britain has, or not just Britain, how the idea of the nation is very much connected or has grown out of the idea of racialized difference?
Well, thank you for your question. I think probably the cop-out answer is a bit of all of those. I think the idea of Britishness is really leveraged in a way to assert their belonging and legitimacy more than newer migrants. But I do think that it feeds into wider anti-immigrant discourses that are very racialized. I mean, we've been talking about Eastern Europeans and how they became problematized. There's so many migrant groups that are just not visible and are able to just go about their lives and not being stigmatized in this way, whether you're from Canada or Australia. And I think it has very much to do with who's seen as an outsider and who's seen as compatible with the British nation. I think because of Eastern Europeans being phenotypically white, it's almost as though the forms of stigmatization that they've experienced is slightly more acceptable, or it wouldn't be that it's framed around contribution or incompatibility and all these other issues. But I think it feeds into racialized hierarchies of minorities and migrants and who has a greater stake, but also who has the privilege of being invisible and able to just not be identified as an immigrant or a problematic immigrant that's poses a threat to the nation.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I suppose that as I was listening, I was just interested that kind of how would you call it? The kind of articulation between all three of those, between whiteness, the nation, and the idea of the state, or the idea, and how you're particularly pinpointing within that how those three things are interplaying in how they are talking about themselves in relation to Britain, because there's so many paradoxes in there, as you know, you kind of put it out. Yeah, so I was just interested to see how you were specifically looking at how those three things are articulated together in order for them to construct their identities or their subjectivity in those ways within this particular context.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I've got a question, but I can hold it back if someone who hasn't yet asked a question would like to go or would like to go now. Well, no one's indicating they are. So I have a question which perhaps relates more to your quantitative data set rather than you could answer it confidently on the basis of your focus groups. But if you can, go ahead. And that's really seeking a little bit more granularity or breakdown about the kind of ethnic minorities who are more leave-leaning or immigration restrictive leaning and so on. So one graph that you showed that of the ethnic minority groups that on which data was available, they were really very close to each other, except for Indians, who were not the same as the white proportion of people who voted leave, but were closer, a bit closer to whites than they were to the other ethnic minorities, who were roughly similar. I'm just interested in whether you've got any other breakdowns to offer within the ethnic minority leave vote or comparable demographic. For instance, generation or class or political party affiliation. Those are the kinds of things I'd be interested in, but if you've got any other variables, like just give us a little bit more detail about, well, what kind of population are we talking about?
Yeah, so in the Understanding Society longitudinal study, which is really the only measure that we have of ethnic minority voting in the EU referendum, unfortunately, there aren't many political attitudes measures within that survey, but we can look at some of the breakdown in terms of who is more likely to vote to leave or remain. So as you mentioned, British Indians were the most likely out of the different minority groups. So I have a paper with Professor Maria Sobolewska and Dr. Nicole Martin, which we do quantitative analysis of the Understanding Society longitudinal study, and we find that people born outside the UK were more likely to vote to leave the EU, and more recent migrants as well were more likely to vote to leave the EU. So my guess would be from the qualitative data that I've gathered that it did have something to do with the perception of unfair immigration rules. We can't say that for certain based on the available survey data, but that's one interpretation. And also more older people and first generation migrants were more likely to vote to leave the EU. Possibly that has something to do with older people in general being more Eurosceptic. And I think there are, it probably needs to be teased out more because it was the more middle class Indians who voted to leave the EU. And whereas in the focus groups, there is a sense of status competition and resource competition that isn't necessarily experienced by British Indians. So my interpretation would be that British Indians who are highly socially and economically integrated, their views mirror the views of the white British on immigration, or a bit more than other minority groups. But it's based on the available data, it's difficult to assess. I actually, Maria Sobolewska and I have a piece that's come out in the iNewspaper last week on the lack of survey data on ethnic minority political attitudes and how there hasn't been enough investment. And we applied for another ethnic minority British election study, but that was rejected. So we are really struggling for quantitative data on ethnic minority political attitudes.
Yeah, that was interesting because one or two things that you said just now seem to run counter to some of the focus group data that you were presenting. So the focus group data, as I think you yourself interpreted as, and several of us here in our comments have, showed that those ethnic minorities that either did identify more strongly with being British or strove for that connection were perhaps more likely to say, well, these other people, these Johnny-come-latelys, they're not really British. They're not British like us. In fact, you know, they suffer from all kinds of stereotypical faults, and you listed them all. You took us through them. Whereas the demographic data you just pointed to, you said that more recent arrivals and people who were born elsewhere and first generation, or at least older people, were more likely to. That suggests the causality moving in the opposite direction. The people who've had less opportunity to become British identifiers were more likely, if you like, they weren't sufficiently integrated into Britain to think of themselves as Europeans, so they were more likely to think, well, Europe, what's that got to do with me?
Possibly, yeah. I think there's also weak identification as European in general amongst British ethnic minorities, and this is what I find in my ethnic and racial studies paper, that many minorities felt that European was a white identity. I think so. The paper with Maria and Nicole is currently under review, so hopefully that will come out soon-ish. But there's a significant effect of not being born in the UK and being recent arrivals on being more likely to vote to leave. And there's, but I think the causality can go in different ways for different minority groups. Yeah, there are quite a few contradictions and different ways that minorities relate. And actually, one of the biggest contradictions is that there is so much Euroscepticism and weak identification with Europe, but the majority still voted to remain. And that, I think, actually had a lot to do with the Brexit campaigns and the racism and xenophobia that people perceived in the support for Brexit.
Well, I think multi-causality and plural interpretations and motives is a good place to perhaps conclude the seminar, because I don't see anyone else asking a question here. In fact, some people have just been leaving. So thank you very much, Neema. That was really interesting. And it's obviously well, I suspect it's going to be a growing subfield of interest, because obviously we haven't had much on this topic before. And now that we're beginning to get some hard data as opposed to kind of journalistic generalizations, I imagine it will grow as a topic of study. So we will always think of you as a pioneer. Thank you very much. And think of you as a Bristolian pioneer, a Bristol space pioneer, moreover. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tarek. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye. And thank you, everyone else.